The Wild West wasn't just a land of gunslingers and dusty streets. It was a brutal frozen wasteland that could freeze you solid before you even realized what was happening. Forget cozy blankets and fireside stories. Settlers battled blizzards that swallowed whole houses, icy winds that felt like daggers, and temperatures that turned frostbite into a daily threat. The winter of 1886 to 1887, it was pure chaos. Cattle froze in their tracks, entire ranches collapsed, and fortunes vanished overnight. Ranchers were forced to abandon their free-roaming cattle and plan meticulously for winter, which always turned out worse than expected. Meanwhile, homesteaders braved isolation and prairie madness, cut off from the world by snow and silence. Survival meant ingenuity, burning buffalo dung for warmth, eating whatever they could scrounge, and bundling up in layers of desperation. In this video, we'll reveal the insane ways settlers fought to survive the deadliest winters of the Wild West. Surviving winter in the Wild West wasn't just about throwing on an extra layer. It was a brutal test of endurance. If your shelter wasn't built right, you might as well have slept outside with the coyotes. Settlers and Native Americans didn't have the luxury of central heating, so they had to get creative with whatever materials they had. A poorly built home meant freezing nights, frost-bitten fingers, and a real chance of not making it to spring. For settlers in wooded areas, log cabins were the go-to choice. They weren't fancy, but they got the job done. Thick logs acted as natural insulation, and every crack and gap had to be sealed with a mix of clay, mud, moss, or whatever else was lying around. This wasn't just for comfort. It was survival. Any draft could turn a cabin into an icebox overnight. The roofs were built steep so the snow wouldn't pile up and cave them in, and doors had to fit snugly or be covered with blankets to stop the cold from creeping in. Windows were kept small, if they even had them, and were covered with stretched animal hide or oiled paper because glass was a luxury most people couldn't afford. In the Great Plains, where trees were scarce, settlers had to work with what they had: dirt. Sod houses, or sodies, were basically homes made of stacked blocks of thick prairie grass and soil. These houses were a nightmare to maintain, with pests, crumbling walls, and dirt falling from the ceiling, but they were lifesavers in winter. The thick walls trapped heat better than wood, keeping the inside warm even during brutal cold snaps. The biggest downside was that heavy rain or snow could cause parts of your house to melt away. Native American tribes had a different approach. The Plains Indians used tipis, which were more adaptable to extreme weather. Wooden poles covered with buffalo hides made for a portable, well-insulated home. In winter, extra layers of hides were added to keep the warmth in, and a fire pit in the center turned the space into a natural heater. Tipis were designed to handle the elements, and when the weather got too harsh, tribes could pack up and move, something settlers stuck in their cabins could only dream about. Then there were the mountain men, fur trappers, and anyone crazy enough to live off the land with nothing but a knife and a rifle. They didn't have time to build houses, so they took advantage of what nature provided. Caves and rock overhangs were ready-made shelters that blocked the wind and snow. Fires were built at the entrances, and whatever materials were available, branches, leaves, animal skins, were used to create makeshift walls and insulation. It wasn't comfortable, but better than freezing to death under an open sky. No matter what kind of shelter you had, making it through winter meant thinking ahead. Beds were built off the ground to prevent heat loss to the freezing earth. Rugs, animal skins, and thick fabrics lined floors and walls to trap warmth. Fireplaces and central fire pits were the only real heat sources. Keeping them going was a full-time job. Running out of firewood wasn't an option unless you wanted to wake up with icicles in your hair. Shelter placement was just as important as construction. If you had any sense, you'd build on a south-facing slope to soak up as much sunlight as possible. Windbreaks, like trees or fences, were set up to block the worst of the icy gusts. In forts and trading posts, buildings were arranged to create a central courtyard, shielding the inside from the worst weather. But surviving the bone-chilling winters of the Wild West wasn't just about finding shelter. It was about dressing smart. If you weren't layered up properly, the cold wouldn't just make you miserable. It could kill you. Settlers, cowboys, and frontiersmen didn't have the luxury of modern thermal wear. Hence, they had to rely on tried-and-true materials to keep people warm for centuries. Every piece of clothing served a purpose, and layering wasn't just a fashion choice, but a survival tactic. Wool was the real MVP of winter clothing. This stuff was everywhere: long johns, shirts, trousers, socks, and even scarves. Why? Wool keeps you warm even when wet, which is crucial in freezing temperatures. Settlers knew sweating was just as dangerous as freezing, since wet clothes could become an icy death trap. Wool had the perfect balance. It trapped body heat while letting moisture escape, preventing that dreaded chill from setting in. But wool alone wasn't enough, especially when temperatures dropped below freezing. That's where animal hides and furs come into play. Deerskin was popular for jackets and pants because it was durable, flexible, and warm. But when the cold got unbearable, people brought out the heavy-duty gear, buffalo robes, and bearskin coats. These weren't just fashion statements. They were essential for staying alive. Mountain men and fur trappers swore by them, often layering multiple furs to lock in as much heat as possible. Sure, they were bulky, but nobody cared about looking sleek when survival was on the line. Cowboys had their own way of handling the cold. Spending long hours on horseback in open plains meant they needed extra protection. Woolly chaps, made from angora goat hides, became their best friends. These fuzzy leg covers kept them warm and protected their legs from thorny brush and biting winds. They also wore thick wool vests, adding warmth and plenty of pockets for carrying small essentials. Practicality was everything in the Wild West. If a piece of clothing didn't serve multiple purposes, it wasn't worth wearing. Headwear was another crucial part of winter gear. While cowboy hats were famous for shielding the sun, they also helped against the cold. Some people lined their hats with fur or wool to keep their heads warm. Others relied on thick scarves or bandanas to wrap around their faces. Icy winds could cause frostbite in minutes, so covering up was a necessity, not an option. A simple wool scarf could mean the difference between staying warm and having your nose turn black from the cold. Then, there was the issue of keeping feet warm. Walking around in freezing temperatures with the wrong footwear was a recipe for frostbite. Leather boots were standard, but they weren't enough on their own. To combat the cold, settlers lined their boots with fur or wore multiple pairs of wool socks. Some even used foot wraps, pieces of cloth wrapped around the feet for extra insulation. When it came to wet and snowy conditions, some settlers switched to moccasins, which were naturally waterproof when treated properly. Warm feet meant better circulation, and better circulation meant staying alive. Kids weren't spared from the cold either. Their clothing was a miniature version of adult outfits, with woolen undergarments, thick trousers or dresses, and plenty of layered sweaters. Mittens, hats, and scarves were usually homemade, often knitted by mothers who knew that a warm child was a living child. Clothes were handed down from sibling to sibling, sometimes patched and resized multiple times to ensure every child had something warm to wear. New clothes were a rare luxury, so every piece was used until it couldn't be mended anymore. Layering wasn't just about throwing on as many clothes as possible. It was a carefully planned system. A moisture-wicking base layer kept sweat from freezing against the skin, a thick insulating layer locked in heat, and a tough outer layer blocked the wind and snow. It was all about adjusting as needed. Too many layers while working could lead to overheating, while too few could be a death sentence. Taking care of winter clothing was just as important as wearing it. Settlers didn't have modern waterproofing sprays, so they used animal fat or beeswax to treat leather boots and coats, making them more moisture-resistant. Wool garments had to be cleaned and stored properly to avoid moth damage, and furs needed regular maintenance to keep them from stiffening. A well-maintained coat could last years, sometimes even passed down through generations. But really, surviving the brutal winters of the Wild West was about more than not just wearing the right clothes. It was about keeping the home warm. Without a proper heat source, freezing temperatures could turn deadly. Settlers had to make do with what they had, constantly improving their heating methods to stay alive. In the early days, open fireplaces were the go-to option. They provided heat and a place to cook, but they weren't exactly efficient. Most of the warmth escaped through the chimney, leaving homes cold unless families stayed beside the fire. Firewood also burned fast, meaning settlers spent a lot of time chopping and hauling logs to keep the fire going. Cast iron stoves were a major improvement. Unlike fireplaces, they radiated heat evenly, keeping rooms warmer for longer while using less fuel. German settlers, in particular, introduced high-quality iron stoves that changed home heating for many. These stoves became a game changer, allowing settlers to conserve firewood and heat multiple rooms more effectively. One of the most famous heating solutions was the Franklin stove, invented by Benjamin Franklin in 1742. Unlike traditional fireplaces, it traps more heat inside the home instead of letting it escape through the chimney. Plus, it cuts down on smoke, making indoor air more breathable. This made it a favorite among frontier families who needed warmth without the hassle of constant refueling. Not all settlers had access to endless firewood, though. On the treeless plains, people had to get creative. They turned to buffalo chips, dried buffalo dung, as a reliable fuel source. As unappealing as it sounds, buffalo chips burned hot and steady without a bad smell. They were easy to gather and provided a practical solution for those far from forests. In areas where coal was available, settlers adapted once again. Coal stoves became popular for their long-lasting heat, especially in regions where transporting firewood wasn't an option. With each advancement, settlers found better ways to keep their homes warm, proving that survival in the Wild West was about making the most of what was available. Okay, but maybe braving the cold alone was not enough to survive. Making sure there was enough food to last through months of freezing temperatures was as important. There were no grocery stores, no refrigerators, and no second chances. If settlers didn't plan ahead, they'd go hungry. That's why food preservation was one of the most important survival skills on the frontier. One of the simplest and most effective ways to keep food from spoiling is drying. Fruits like apples, peaches, and berries were sliced and spread out under cheesecloth in the sun. The heat pulled out the moisture, preventing bacteria from growing and making the food lightweight and easy to store. Vegetables like beans and corn went through the same process, often strung up to dry in well-ventilated spaces. For meat, settlers relied on smoking. Pork, beef, and even wild game were rubbed with salt to draw out moisture, then hung in a smokehouse where they absorbed the smoke from slow-burning hardwood fires. This gave the meat a rich, smoky flavor, and acted as a natural preservative. Depending on how long it was smoked, the meat could last weeks or months. Another method, salting, was also even more common, especially for large cuts of meat and fish. The meat was either soaked in a salty brine or packed directly in salt, which sucked out moisture and kept bacteria at bay. Properly salted meat could last the entire winter, making it one of the most reliable protein storage methods. For many indigenous communities and fur traders, pemmican was the ultimate survival food. It was made by pounding dried meat into a powder and mixing it with melted fat, sometimes with dried berries for extra flavor. This dense, high-energy food was lightweight, easy to carry, and lasted months without spoiling. It was a lifeline during long hunting trips or harsh winters, when fresh food was scarce. Fermentation also plays a big role in food preservation. Cabbage was turned into sauerkraut through lactofermentation, which not only made it last longer, but also boosted its nutritional value. Milk was transformed into cheese and yogurt, providing a steady dairy source without refrigeration. When canning was introduced in the mid-1800s, it changed everything. By sealing fruits, vegetables, and even meat in airtight glass jars and heating them to kill bacteria, settlers could safely store a wider variety of foods. This meant more balanced meals during the winter, with fresh-tasting fruits and vegetables long after the harvest season ended. However, preserving food was only half the battle. Settlers had to store it properly. That's where root cellars came in. These underground storage rooms used the Earth's stable temperature to keep food cool and fresh. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, and onions could last for months in these cool, humid conditions. Salted meats and canned goods were also stored in cellars, ensuring families had enough to eat until spring. Life in the Wild West was tough, and going alone wasn't an option. Surviving meant working together, sharing resources, and lending a hand when needed. Communities weren't just about friendship, they were the backbone of survival. One of the best examples of this was barn raisings. Building a barn was no small task. One family alone couldn't do it. So neighbors would come together, bringing tools, skills, and sheer manpower to get the job done. These weren't just work days, but social events with food, laughter, and a sense of unity. The harvest season was another time when teamwork was everything. Crops had to be gathered before winter set in, and if a family fell behind, they could lose their entire food supply. Neighbors would pitch in, moving from farm to farm, ensuring everyone had enough storage for the cold months. When sickness struck, the community became even more important. Doctors were rare, so people relied on each other. Women often acted as midwives and healers, sharing herbal remedies and nursing the sick back to health. If someone was too ill to work, others cared for their farm, ensuring no family was left struggling. Winters could be brutal, and supplies sometimes ran low. If one family ran out of firewood or food, neighbors would step in to help. Resource sharing was common, not just out of kindness, but because everyone knew survival depended on it. One bad winter could be devastating, but together, people had a fighting chance. Education was also a community effort. Settlers pooled their money and labor to build schoolhouses and hire teachers. These schools were more than just classrooms. They became places for town meetings, religious gatherings, and social events, strengthening family bonds. Trade and barter systems kept communities running. Instead of money, people exchanged goods and services. A blacksmith might repair a wagon in exchange for fresh vegetables, while a seamstress could trade clothing for firewood. This system ensured everyone had what they needed, even when cash was scarce. The Wild West was full of hardships, but no one had to face them alone. The community was everything. Surviving winter in the Wild West wasn't just about stacking firewood and bundling up. It was about adjusting every part of life to handle the bitter cold. Settlers and indigenous communities had no choice but to adapt, making smart choices to stay warm, safe, and strong through the long, freezing months. The body itself had to adjust. Those exposed to cold for long periods developed better circulation, allowing them to tolerate lower temperatures without freezing. But people didn't rely on their bodies getting used to the cold. They intentionally chose to stay warm. Daily routines changed with the seasons. Since the mornings and nights were often brutally cold, settlers scheduled chores for the warmest part of the day. Whether gathering firewood, fetching water, or tending to animals, they limited their exposure when temperatures were at their worst. Hard labor was also kept to a minimum to conserve energy, as winter took a toll on strength and endurance. Food became more than just a necessity. It was a tool for survival. Diets were packed with fats and proteins, which helped generate body heat and maintain energy. Indigenous communities relied on pemmican, a mix of dried meat and fat, providing a long-lasting, high-energy food source. Settlers, too, adjusted their eating habits, consuming heartier meals to keep their bodies fueled for the cold months. Shelters were modified to keep out the biting wind and snow. Windbreaks made of wood, brush, or even stacked hay helped protect homes and barns. Paths between buildings were clear to prevent people from getting stuck or injured in deep snow. Inside, thick rugs, heavy curtains, and additional insulation helped trap as much heat as possible. Even social habits changed. Instead of outdoor gatherings, people spent more time indoors, telling stories, playing music, and strengthening community bonds. This wasn't just for entertainment. It was crucial for mental well-being during the isolating winter months. The brutal winters of the Wild West tested every ounce of human endurance. Yet those who survived weren't just tough. They were smart, resourceful, and willing to adapt. Their survival strategies hold lessons that still apply today. First, resourcefulness was everything. Settlers and indigenous communities didn't have endless supplies, so they used whatever was available. They built sturdy shelters with local materials, crafted warm clothing from animal hides, and found clever ways to store food for months. They didn't waste anything. Every item had a purpose, and creativity often meant the difference between comfort and hardship. The community was key. No one survived alone. Neighbors worked together to build barns, harvest crops, and share resources when someone struggled. Winters were harsh, but knowing help was always nearby made them easier to endure. Emotional support was just as important as physical aid, keeping spirits high when the cold seemed never-ending. Adaptability was a must. Instead of fighting against nature, people adjusted to it. Routines changed with the seasons. Diets became richer in fats for warmth, and travel was minimized to conserve energy. This flexibility allowed them to survive even the most unpredictable winters. Indigenous knowledge was invaluable. Settlers who learned from Native American communities gained a survival advantage. From food preservation methods to efficient winter clothing, indigenous practices were built on generations of experience, making them incredibly effective. Above all, preparedness was non-negotiable. Those who planned ahead, stockpiled food, insulated their homes, and worked together stood the best chance of succeeding. The Wild West's winters were unforgiving, but careful preparation meant survival wasn't just possible but achievable. Resourcefulness, community, adaptability, learning from others, and preparation are timeless lessons. They weren't just survival strategies. They were a way of life. Even today, they remind us that resilience isn't about brute strength. It's about thinking ahead, working together, and maximizing what we have. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.